Well, time now to summon the ghosts of Christmas, past, present and future. Danny Finkelstein used to work for Conservative Central Office and now writes for The Times. Sally Morgan worked for Tony Blair in Downing Street. And Mark Pack is editor of Lib Dem Voice and a prolific blogger and general commentator. I was going to say nuisance. Commentator. Now, let's talk about the papers as well. Interesting that a government that misses its self-imposed target is actually getting a reasonably good press tomorrow.
Yes, but I think the reality is that how incomes change will be how people really react. So the politics in the House of Commons, partly because Ed Balls didn't do as well as he should have done, partly because George Osborne was confident. The politics was quite good. They'll get a reasonable press in tomorrow's papers. We've seen that already. But still, the decisions they've made are very hard for people. That's very hard, incidentally, not just politically. It's also, hard to see because it means that people on quite low incomes will be squeezed, and that's very difficult.
So in the Times, hard road to 2018 kind of catches it, doesn't it?
It's a summary. You couldn't listen to those figures without thinking that, and obviously what we wanted to do was capture that in our headline.
So why has Danny's already mentioned Ed Balls' performance today, and there is a lot of hostile criticism from Labour supporters about how you kind of missed an open goal.
I was surprised by Ed's performance because I think it was a pretty open goal. Because although George Osborne performed well, the message was pretty bleak, and I thought particularly bad. Although he had political headlines that were rather effective. If you look at the two groups that I'd be worried about if I was a Tory backbencher, I'd be worried about the people in the 40% tax band, absolute prime target voters for them. And I'd also be worried about labelling everybody as welfare scroungers when a lot of them are at work. And I think, look, this will unfold in the days and the weeks to come, as always, but they've had a pretty decent first 24 hours, is my guess.
When you look at the Lib Dem contribution, you saw Danny Alexander a moment or so ago, but you saw that moment in George Osborne's speech where Nick Clegg is sitting behind him and virtually rolling his eyes because George Osborne's dismissed the mansion tax and generally acting in a pretty disloyal sort of fashion. What do you think the Lib Dems got out of this today?
Well, I think that was actually quite astute of Nick Clegg because, those sort of facial expressions can be a very effective way of conveying disagreement, and it's no secret that Liberal Democrats and Tories disagree fundamentally on taxing wealth and taxing property. So I think Clegg played quite a smart move there in terms of playing up that difference, but in a way that didn't overshadow the main news, because I think that was the mistake both parties in government made for the budget in the spring. There were some bits of really good news in there, but so much of it was leaked in advance that all the news on the day was bad news. This time they got it right, and it was the good news that limited good news, but nonetheless bits of good news, such as the extra cuts in income tax, the OBR figures being better than people are expecting, although obviously OBR figures should be taken with a few pinches of salt. But there were some bits of good news today, and that they were genuine surprises.
Actually, the OBR figures, just on the OBR forecasts, like all economics forecasts, are difficult. But the OBR figures, that is to say, their analysis of the situation and the figures that are underneath it in terms of the budget, those are very important for George Osborne. They basically allow him to argue that it's not his fiscal policy that created this situation. So the credibility of the OBR on the forecasts has taken a dent because everyone's forecasts were wrong. But the credibility underneath the budget on the OBR is critical, actually.
But people in the country want to know whether George Osborne can put it right. In the end, it's a pretty esoteric argument about OBR figures or somebody else's figure. The question is, can this man put the economy on the right track? And that's in the end where
we know something key about the ground on which the next election will be formed. Don't we, as a consequence of today?
We certainly do, and it's a very different place than we all expected it to be 2 years ago.
The advantage of winning in the House of Commons was that the biggest danger today for George Osborne was to be seen to be not making any progress, because the figures really could lend themselves to that analysis very heavily. And the fact that Ed Balls failed to make that point, I think, did give George Osborne an advantage. But in the long run, people don't really watch these events. They don't know what's happening in the House of Commons. They'll feel this in their pockets, and that's the problem for the government.
What about this suggestion that shortly before the election there'd be a bit of tickling up of the economy so people feel slightly better? Allegra, is she very cynical?
No, they've got to get the last year right, and they've got to make sure that in the last year they don't impose unexpected increases in tax or reductions in benefit.
it's going to be an interesting sort of environment then in which to fight an election, because the challenge for Labour is quite difficult, isn't it?
The challenge for Labour is, I mean, I think Labour are okay at the moment, not bringing forward a comprehensive plan. It's mad for an opposition to do this at this stage. I mean, it'd be completely crazy, and we got it wrong a long time in a previous life doing that. So I think Labour is exactly right. However, clearly we can't go into the election in that position, and that's the challenge.
And the
in the next
benefits
18
thing
months.
is very interesting. This question of 1% and how they jump on that is going to put them in a very awkward spot politically, isn't it?
Except at the moment. What George Osborne did today will unravel, I think, because in a sense he's labelling all the benefit people as not at work and not seeking work, and it was perfectly clear that was not supported as a headline by the Liberals, and it's certainly not the reality. So
but that's what I think was quite smart from his point of view about saying there will be a vote in Parliament on that, because people like Rachel Reeves and Ed Balls can't sidestep that. They will face, but that will be very difficult for, I think, a lot of Liberal Democrats as well, particularly Liberal Democrat peers. I mean, people like Ed Balls and so on have got a lot to work out about how Labour's going to handle that. I think if I was the Lib Dem chief whip in the House of Lords, I would be thinking this is going to be quite a tricky vote to get.
We don't
Politics
vote
of
on
the mansion
finances.
tax are what interests me. You said we knew how the election was going to go and what the issues were going to be, but the politics of the mansion tax, I think, are now going to be critical. The Liberal Democrats, as Nick Clegg was indicating, are clearly going to propose a mansion tax. Vince Cable seems to have won that battle. It looks like Labour will as well, which will mean they've got a position off the baseline in which they've got some money, and the Tories will have to show how they're going to match that. So I think we learnt today something else about the general election, which was there'll be a lot of arguing about the mansion tax.
And good for you think?
I think so, because I suspect what we will see the Liberal Democrats at the general election is saying mansion tax and using that revenue to cut income tax further, so that to say that if you're earning a national minimum wage in a full-time job, you shouldn't have to pay any income tax at all. And I think that's a very attractive headline proposition. It'll be very hard, I think, for the Tories in particular to say, no, instead of doing that, we want to spend that money in other respects, or we don't want to bring in the money for the mansion tax at all. It'd be very tough for the Tories to say, actually, minimum wage people, no, you should pay income tax.
But why would people vote Liberal for that, not Labour, actually? I mean, that's going to be your problem in the next general election, because...
All right, we'll reconvene after Christmas, I think.